Hello, LifeGroup leaders. I'm Gary Briggs. Today I get to fly solo. Brother Tom and Richard couldn't be with me, so wanted to share with you some of my thoughts regarding our lesson. We're going to be on page 92. The title of the lesson is Where is the Balance? So we'll be talking about kind of keeping a balanced life. I think that's part of the takeaways from today's lesson. On page 94 is where the scripture begins. So as maybe a little prerequisite, as we know, we have a lot of freedom being teachers that we can add some supporting verses, some thoughts of our own, I guess within reason. We don't want to get too far off the reservation, but as I was reading the lesson today, I came to a conclusion that before we can kind of get into today's lesson, we may need to pull back a little bit and kind of get a little bigger picture and just a review of some things that we need to know that can kind of lay a foundation for today's lesson. So the first verse in our lesson is in Ecclesiastes 7, verse 11 through 22. The first word of this verse 11 is wisdom is as good as an inheritance. And you see that word wisdom, and the first thing I thought about is this is Solomon writing this verse in Ecclesiastes, and we think, well, he's the kind of the master of wisdom. We know kind of the beginning there of him as king when he was a young man, and I thought it'd be good. And in fact, this is the approach I'm going to take. Again, you have the freedom to take any approach you want. But before we even get into the Ecclesiastes section, let's kind of do a little walk through some other verses. So let's go to 1 Kings, and just kind of a quick reminder of where this came about with Solomon. 1 Kings chapter 3, and it starts in verse 9 through 15. I'll just read that real quick, and again, familiar. So here is Solomon talking to God. So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours? And then verse 10, the Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for this. So God said to him, since you have asked for this and not for a long life for yourself. And then verse 12, I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart. So here, Solomon himself knew the value and the importance of wisdom, and it's basically to be discerning so you're a good judge of what's right and what's wrong. So he asked for wisdom because he knew he needed it. And I think that's a good takeaway for us that we need to all admit. And so, kind of along that line, well, what is wisdom? Where does it come from? We see here Solomon asks for it. It comes from God. And then, what are some characteristics, or what are some things that wisdom does when we receive wisdom from God? What changes does that make in our attitude, our behavior, our lifestyle, our decision making? And that's what really today's lesson is all about. So we see that Solomon is a good example for us to use in our class to say that he himself acknowledged the fact that he needed wisdom. He approached God very humbly, without arrogance or pride, not a know-it-all attitude, was very humble and asked God for wisdom, and God gave it to him. So then we know just a chapter or two, or actually a book or two before Ecclesiastes is the whole book of Proverbs, and there's many. I just handpicked a few, but it gives us a kind of a glimpse into Solomon's mind and heart. The first chapter of Proverbs, Solomon says, this proverb of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, for attaining wisdom and discipline, for understanding words of insight, for acquiring a disciplined and prudent life. So wisdom has a positive effect, as it says here, for discipline, words of insight, acquiring discipline and prudent life, for doing what is right and just and fair in verse 3, for giving prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the young. Verse 5, let the wise listen and add to their learning. So a wise person, according to verse 5, is a teachable person. And let the discerning get guidance for understanding proverbs and parables. And then verse 7 is a very familiar verse. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. And then the second part of verse 7, the opposite of a wise person is that four-letter word here, a fool. But fools despise wisdom and discipline. So you see the people who want to be teachable and have the positive attributes of wisdom embrace wisdom, but foolish people despise it and reject it, which is sad. So Solomon, even in Proverbs, there were many there. There's a couple more I'll mention that you might want to use and just reference. Again, we hadn't even gotten to today's Ecclesiastes, but I think these are some good reminders. Here's one in Proverbs 13:20. He who walks with the wise grows wise, but a companion of fools suffers harm. So here again, a great proverb that wise people hang out with wise people, which is kind of the old be careful who your friends are. We see Proverbs 29:11 is a good one to remember. A fool gives full vent to his anger, but a wise man keeps himself under control. So again, an example of what a wise person, how he conducts and behaves himself. Let's look at one more. Proverbs 19:20 is a good one. 19 verse 20, if I can find it here. Listen to the advice and accept instruction, and in the end you will be wise. It's interesting, and I can think of several examples of people who are teachable, who are willing to participate in LifeGroup, come to church, be under the leadership of our pastor and others who will speak into their lives. And it's just a good example of people who want to be wise and learn and accept instruction, as it says in verse 20 here. So again, some examples Solomon gave in the Proverbs. Let's go one more example, and we'll jump to the New Testament. And we remember Jesus' Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, I think it's 5, 6, and 7. And after all that teaching of lifestyle, of how to live a prudent, godly life, and you can kind of review that and handpick some of those things. At the end of that teaching, and as children, we sang the song about the wise man who built his house upon the rock, and the rains came tumbling down. But here's what it says. These are Jesus' words. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine, all these words that he had been teaching, and puts them into practice. So it's not just hearing, but it's actually a lifestyle behavior, putting them into practice. It's like a wise man who built his house on the rock. It says the rains came down, the storms of life, as we've heard sermons. The streams rose, winds blew, beat against the house, but it did not fall. Conversely, but everyone who hears the words, this is kind of the fool verse that we read in Psalm or Proverbs, who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who builds his house on the sand. And we know the importance of wise thinking to build our house upon godly principles. So, kind of, what is wisdom? It's really it's the information we need to live a godly lifestyle that will affect our behavior in our family, our community, our church, to make wise decisions versus foolish decisions. one thing I've heard, and you may have heard me say before, that knowledge is cumulative. There's things that I can think of my cell phone that as technology increases and improves, the things in code is written, the cell phones get smarter and smarter. We call them smartphones. However, wisdom is not cumulative. It has to be relearned every generation. My kids, my grandkids, others have to learn and choose to get the godly wisdom that they need. It's an individual choice. So it would be nice, I guess, if you could pass it on, but that's not how God designed life and everything. We have to be able to do, to gain wisdom and be teachable. One more reference that we think of is in James, and then we'll do this before we get into the Ecclesiastes verses. But James chapter 1, again familiar, verse 5. Well, let me start at verse 2. James said, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials." Again, kind of the house on the rock, the storms of life, but trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Perseverance must finish, so that you may be mature. And then verse 5, "If any of you lacks wisdom," and he was nice in the way he said that. He could have said, "Because all of you or all of us do indeed lack wisdom, we should ask God." And it said, "And he gives generously to all without finding fault." So one of the takeaway points is, if we need wisdom to know how to live life correctly and handle life's trials and not become bitter and blame God for the things that happen in life that don't go our way, then we ask God, and we do need the wisdom. So we just like Solomon, we read in 1 Kings, ask God for wisdom. James is reminding us in the New Testament to ask God for wisdom. I think it's important that we realize that it's good to ask God for wisdom. So then we get into our lesson today, and again, not going to read every verse, but I just went through and picked out the kind of the attributes or the benefits of wisdom. And we see in verse 11, wisdom is good. It's similar to an inheritance. It's an advantage to those. It provides protection, it says in verse 12. It also says wisdom preserves the life of its owner. So you can go down and kind of handpick the benefits of being the type of person who is open and teachable and who asks God for wisdom. It even makes a wise man stronger. Their ability to live life and have joy and peace, even in the midst of trials, as James said, understanding that God's in control. God is sovereign, and we may not understand life's ups and downs and God's master plan for us, but we can have confidence with wisdom that it's in our best interest. So wisdom provides stability and a deep trust in God. So as you go down the verses, kind of handpick, at verse 19 again, wisdom makes the wise person stronger than 10 rulers of the city. There's a talk about balanced life, not to live life with extremes of being too up or too down, by having kind of a balanced attitude and mindset, and the good and the times that aren't so good when the trials come. So let me just wrap up with maybe a couple of so what takeaways. I thought about myself and the need to ask God daily for wisdom on how to make wise decisions. And I see it as a kind of a picture of a glass of water or something, that as I pour or let God's wisdom come into my life, it will displace the foolish thinking and foolish decision making. And so I want to be filled with wise thinking, wise choices. So I need to be, just like James said, ask God for wisdom, like Solomon did, ask God for wisdom in their life. And we know from what James said and what God did in Solomon, when you ask, he will give you wisdom. Having wisdom will let me choose to live life believing and depending on God, and being a person that is humble but yet wise. It allows me to model godly living to my family, my friends, my community, my church, and it will allow me to point others to Christ and their need to make a wise decision. And the wisest decision anyone could make would be to believe in Jesus and to follow him and be teachable and choose to make wise decisions in their life. So that's kind of where I was going with today's lesson. I know I've added a lot of other scriptures and a lot of other references there that you may or may not want to use, but I was motivated to pull back and try to get a little bigger picture of what wisdom is, how it really affects my behavior, my attitudes, where does wisdom come from, what are its benefits, and how God is always willing to give his people good things when we ask, like he wants to give us wisdom so we can live a life that's pleasing to him. So hopefully some of these thoughts have helped, and I hope you have a good week and a good class on Sunday. Thank you.